On a sweltering August night in 1996, 5 cousins gathered at their grandmother's farmhouse in rural Nebraska for what should have been an ordinary family reunion. By dawn, all 5 had vanished without a trace, leaving behind half-eaten meals, running water in the bathroom sink, and a handwritten note that simply read, "We're going to see what's down there." For 29 years, their disappearance remained one of the Midwest's most baffling unsolved mysteries, until a catastrophic flood in the summer of 2025 exposed something beneath the old farmhouse that would finally reveal the horrifying truth about what happened that night, and the dark secret that had been buried in the Nebraska soil for generations. If you're fascinated by true mysteries and unsolved cases, subscribe now and join us as we uncover the truth behind the vanishing at Riverside Farm. The photograph sat on Detective Sarah Brennan's desk, its edges worn from nearly 3 decades of handling. 5 young faces smiled at the camera, arms draped around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a weathered white farmhouse. The image had been taken on August 3, 1996, just hours before they disappeared. Marcus Webb, 19, the eldest, stood in the center with his characteristic confident grin. To his left was his sister Lily Webb, 17, her long auburn hair catching the afternoon sunlight. On the right stood their cousins, Jennifer Hartwell, 16, Claire Hartwell, 14, and the youngest, Daniel Hartwell, 12. All 5 shared the same prominent cheekbones and dark eyes, the unmistakable features of the Webb-Hartwell bloodline. Sarah had inherited the case 6 months ago when the previous detective, Harold Vance, retired after 40 years of service. On his last day, Harold had placed the file on her desk with hands that trembled slightly from age and frustration. "This one never let me sleep right," he'd said, his voice gravelly with emotion. 29 years, Sarah. Those kids deserve better than what we've given them." The official investigation had concluded in 2001 with no definitive answers. The prevailing theory suggested the cousins had run away together, perhaps fleeing some family trouble no one wanted to discuss. But Sarah had read every interview, studied every piece of evidence, and something fundamental didn't align with that conclusion. Teenagers might run away, but they didn't vanish so completely that not a single trace of them emerged in nearly 3 decades. No bank transactions, no social security numbers activated, no sightings despite national coverage. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. Sarah looked out her office window at the rain hammering against the glass. The summer of 2025 had brought unprecedented flooding to eastern Nebraska, and the Missouri River had swollen to levels not seen in a century. Hundreds of homes had been evacuated, including many in the rural areas surrounding the small town of Riverside. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed Sheriff Morrison. "Brennan," she answered. "Sarah, you need to get out to the old Webb farmhouse, now." The sheriff's voice carried an urgency she'd rarely heard from the normally unflappable man. The flood undermined the foundation. Part of the structure collapsed into a sinkhole. "And?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her jacket. There was a pause, then, "And we found something underneath. Something that's been down there a very long time. I think it might be connected to your cold case." Sarah's eyes drifted back to the photograph on her desk. 5 smiling faces, frozen in time, unaware that they had only hours left in the world above ground. "I'm on my way," she said, grabbing her keys and the case file. As she hurried toward the parking lot, she couldn't shake the feeling that after 29 years of silence, Riverside Farm was finally ready to give up its secrets. The drive to Riverside Farm took Sarah 45 minutes through sheets of rain that turned the rural roads into muddy rivers. Her SUV's wipers worked furiously against the deluge, and twice she had to navigate around fallen tree branches that blocked the narrow country highway. The Weather Service had issued flash flood warnings for the entire county, and the radio crackled with updates about evacuations and rising water levels. When she finally turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to the Webb property, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The farmhouse, which had stood sentinel over these fields for over a century, now tilted at a disturbing angle. The entire western corner had collapsed into the earth, revealing a gaping darkness beneath the foundation. Emergency vehicles clustered in the front yard, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. Sheriff Morrison stood near the collapsed section, his rain jacket slick with water, talking to a member of the county's search and rescue team. He looked up as Sarah approached, his weathered face grave. "Sarah," he greeted her, raising his voice over the drumming rain. "Thanks for getting here so fast. Watch your step, the ground's unstable." She followed him carefully toward the edge of the collapse, where orange safety cones marked the perimeter. The sinkhole was roughly 15 feet in diameter, the broken floorboards of the farmhouse jutting out like broken teeth. But it was what lay below that made Sarah's pulse quicken. In the beam of the rescue team's high-powered flashlights, she could see the outline of what appeared to be a constructed space beneath the farmhouse. Not a natural cavity, but something deliberately built. Stone walls, partially collapsed, extended into darkness. "What is that?" Sarah asked, leaning forward cautiously. "Some kind of cellar?" "That's what we thought at first," Morrison replied. "But cellars don't usually have doors that lock from the outside." He gestured to one of the rescue workers, who angled his light to illuminate a heavy wooden door, still attached to its frame despite the collapse around it. An iron bolt was clearly visible, positioned on the exterior side. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold rain soaking through her jacket. A room designed to keep someone in, hidden beneath a family farmhouse for decades. "Have you sent anyone down yet?" she asked. Morrison shook his head, waiting for structural engineers to assess the safety. "But Sarah," he paused, his expression troubled. "We found something else. Evidence that someone's been down there. Recently?" "Recently? The house has been abandoned for over 20 years. I know. But look at this." Morrison pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph taken by one of the first responders. In the image, clearly visible despite the debris, was a modern plastic water bottle lying near the underground entrance. The label was faded but recognizable as a brand that hadn't existed in 1996. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If someone had been accessing this hidden space in recent years, it meant the secret of Riverside Farm had never truly been abandoned. Someone knew about the chamber beneath the house. Someone who had kept that knowledge hidden for almost 3 decades. "I need to go down there," Sarah said firmly. Morrison started to protest, but she cut him off. "This is my case, Tom. If there's any chance that what's down there is connected to those 5 missing cousins, I need to see it firsthand." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Let me get you suited up with safety gear, but you wait for my signal. If the engineers say it's too unstable, we do this by remote camera first." "Understood." "Understood." While Morrison coordinated with the structural team, Sarah walked the perimeter of the property, trying to visualize the layout as it had been in 1996. The farmhouse had belonged to Evelyn Webb, the grandmother of Marcus and Lily. According to the case files, Evelyn had been in her late 70s when her grandchildren disappeared, suffering from advancing dementia. She had died 2 years later in a nursing home, having never provided coherent answers about that night. The property had passed to Evelyn's daughter, Catherine Webb, mother of Marcus and Lily. But Catherine had never returned to the farm after her children vanished. She'd moved to Oregon and died of cancer in 2018, taking whatever she might have known to her grave. The farmhouse had stood empty ever since, slowly succumbing to weather and neglect. Sarah pulled out the case file she'd brought, protecting it from the rain under her jacket. She flipped to the witness statements from August 4th, 1996, when the disappearance was first reported. It had been Jennifer and Claire's mother, Patricia Hartwell, who'd raised the alarm. She'd dropped her daughters and son, Daniel, off at the farm on the evening of August 3rd for what was supposed to be a weekend reunion. The plan was for the 5 cousins to spend time together at their grandmother's house while the adults attended a family wedding in Omaha. When Patricia returned on the afternoon of August 4th to pick up her children, she'd found the front door unlocked, the television still on, and no sign of the 5 teenagers. Evelyn had been found asleep in her bedroom upstairs, confused and unable to explain where her grandchildren had gone. The initial police response had been measured. Teenagers often wandered off, especially in groups. But when a search of the property and surrounding fields yielded nothing, and when 24 hours passed with no contact, the investigation intensified. Sarah had read the transcripts of Patricia Hartwell's interviews dozens of times. The woman's initial concern had shifted to frantic desperation as days turned to weeks with no trace of her children. She died in 2015, her obituary noting that she was preceded in death by her beloved children, Jennifer, Claire, and Daniel, forever missed. A shout from the collapsed section pulled Sarah from her thoughts. She hurried back to find Morrison waving her over. "Engineers gave us a tentative green light," he said. "The cavity below appears structurally sound, separate from the house foundation. They think it was originally built into the natural bedrock, but we need to move fast before more of the house comes down." Sarah donned the safety harness and helmet that the rescue team provided, then watched as they set up a pulley system to lower someone into the darkness below. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked the clasps on her harness, not from fear of the descent, but from the weight of what they might find. "Ready?" asked Jake Winters, the lead rescue technician, a man in his 30s with kind eyes and capable hands. Sarah nodded, positioning herself at the edge of the opening. "Ready." The descent was slow and carefully controlled, the rain-slicked rope turning in the rescue team's practiced hands. As Sarah was lowered into the cavity, the sounds of the storm above gradually muffled, replaced by the drip of water and the creak of stressed wood. Her boots touched solid stone. She unclipped from the harness and activated her high-powered flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The space was larger than she'd expected, roughly 20 feet square, with walls of cut stone that spoke of deliberate construction rather than natural formation. The floor was dirt and stone, scattered with debris from the partial collapse above. Sarah's light swept across the room, cataloging details. In one corner, she saw the rusted remains of what might have been a cot or bed frame. Against another wall stood a small table, its wood warped and rotting. And then her light found something that made her breath catch in her throat. Scratched into the stone wall, barely visible beneath decades of dirt and moisture, were words. Sarah moved closer, her heart pounding, and used her gloved hand to carefully brush away the grime. The message emerged slowly, carved with something sharp, the letters uneven but deliberate. "Help us. Grandma locked us down here. We can't get out." August 4, 1996. Below it, in different handwriting, smaller and shakier. "The air is getting bad. Marcus." Sarah's flashlight trembled in her hand as she stared at the carved message. 29 years of questions suddenly crystallized into a single, horrifying answer. The 5 cousins hadn't run away. They had been trapped down here, imprisoned beneath their own grandmother's house, calling out for help that never came. "Sarah, what do you see?" Morrison's voice crackled through the radio clipped to her harness. She forced herself to respond, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Tom, I need the forensic team down here immediately. And get me everything we have on Evelyn Webb, medical records, psychiatric evaluations, everything." "What did you find?" "Evidence that this was a crime scene. The cousins were here, locked in this chamber. They carved messages into the wall." There was a sharp intake of breath from above, then Morrison's terse response. "Copy that. Stay put. Team's coming down." While she waited, Sarah forced herself to continue documenting the space. Her training took over, compartmentalizing the emotional impact to focus on the evidence. She photographed the carved messages from multiple angles, then began a systematic examination of the rest of the chamber. The bed frame in the corner was indeed a cot, The metal rusted and partially collapsed. Nearby, she found what appeared to be the remnants of blankets, now little more than rotted fabric. A bucket in the far corner had likely served as a latrine, its purpose unmistakable even after decades. On the small table, Sarah discovered something that sent another chill down her spine. 5 plates, arranged in a neat row. They were simple ceramic plates, the kind found in any farmhouse, but their placement was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Beside them lay corroded utensils and what appeared to be the remains of dried food, now just dark stains on the porcelain. Sarah's mind worked through the implications. Someone had fed them, at least initially. The plates suggested meals had been brought down to the imprisoned cousins, but the messages on the wall indicated growing desperation. "The air is getting bad," Marcus had written. She turned her attention to the door Morrison had mentioned, the one with the exterior bolt. It had fallen partially from its frame during the collapse, but its construction was clear. Heavy oak reinforced with iron bands, the kind of door that wouldn't yield to teenage shoulders no matter how desperately they threw themselves against it. Near the door's base, Sarah noticed something else. Scratch marks on the wood, deep gouges that could only have been made by fingernails. The mental image of 5 terrified teenagers clawing at the door, their screams unheard by anyone who might help, threatened to overwhelm her professional detachment. The sound of equipment and voices above signaled the arrival of the forensic team. One by one, they were lowered into the chamber. David Park, the county's lead forensic investigator. Lisa Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the state, and 2 additional technicians with evidence collection equipment. David's expression was grim as he took in the scene. "Jesus," he muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry, it's just, I worked the initial missing persons case in '96. I was fresh out of training. We searched this entire property, including the basement of the house." "There was a basement?" Sarah asked. "A root cellar accessible through an exterior door. We checked it thoroughly. Completely empty except for some old preserves." He gestured at the stone walls around them. "This chamber was separate, hidden. The only access appears to be through that collapsed section." Lisa was already examining the walls, her flashlight moving methodically across the stone surface. "This is old construction," she observed. "These stones show weathering and tool marks consistent with late 19th or early 20th century work. This room predates the farmhouse by decades." Sarah moved to join her. "So it was already here when the house was built?" "Most likely. Farmsteads in this region sometimes had storm shelters or storage chambers built into natural rock formations. The house was probably constructed over it, either deliberately or because the builders were unaware of its existence." "But Evelyn Webb knew about it," Sarah said, her voice hard. "She knew, and she used it as a prison." David had moved to the carved message on the wall, photographing it with meticulous care. "We'll need to verify the handwriting, but if this is authentic, it fundamentally changes everything about this case. This wasn't a voluntary disappearance. This was unlawful imprisonment." "Why?" asked one of the technicians, a young woman named Rachel, whose face had gone pale. Why would a grandmother lock her own grandchildren underground? It was the question Sarah had been asking herself since reading The Wall. Evelyn Webb had been described by witnesses as a loving, if forgetful, matriarch. Her dementia had been well documented. Could the disease have caused a psychotic break severe enough to imprison 5 teenagers? "We need to find remains," Lisa said quietly, breaking into Sarah's thoughts. "If they died down here, there should be evidence." The team spread out, beginning a careful grid search of the chamber. Sarah watched them work, her mind turning over the timeline. The message was dated August 4th, 1996, the day after the cousins arrived at the farm. They'd been locked down here within hours of gathering for their reunion. Patricia Hartwell had dropped her children off around 6 p.m. on August 3rd. According to her statement, Evelyn had seemed lucid and welcoming. The teenagers had been in good spirits, looking forward to a weekend of freedom from parental supervision. But sometime between 6 p.m. on August 3rd and the afternoon of August 4th, when Patricia returned, Evelyn had somehow managed to get all 5 cousins down into this hidden chamber and lock them inside. "Detective Brennan," Lisa's voice cut through her thoughts. "You need to see this." Sarah made her way to where Lisa knelt near the far wall of the chamber. The anthropologist had cleared away a layer of dirt and debris, revealing what appeared to be fabric, darkened with age and moisture. "Clothing," Lisa said. "Multiple items, and look here." She carefully lifted a piece of the fabric to reveal what lay beneath. Bones, small bones, human bones, arranged in what looked like a deliberate pile. "Is that—" Sarah couldn't finish the question. Lisa nodded grimly. "Skeletal remains. Based on preliminary observation, I'm seeing bones from multiple individuals. We'll need to excavate carefully, but Detective Brennan, I think we've found your missing cousins." Sarah stepped back, her training barely keeping her emotions in check. After 29 years, the families would finally have answers. But those answers would bring no comfort. The 5 young people in the photograph on her desk had died down here, trapped in darkness, abandoned by the one person who should have protected them. "Wait," David said suddenly, his flashlight focused on the pile of remains. "Lisa, how many individuals would you estimate are here?" The anthropologist leaned closer, her experienced eye examining the bones with practiced precision. Her brow furrowed in concentration, then confusion. "That's odd," she murmured. "Based on what I'm seeing, Detective, there are too many bones here. Far too many for just 5 people." Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "What do you mean, too many?" Lisa looked up, her expression troubled. "I mean that unless I'm very much mistaken, we're looking at the remains of at least 8 to 10 individuals, maybe more, and not all of them are recent." The chamber fell silent except for the steady drip of water from above. Sarah's mind reeled with the implication. If the Webb cousins were here, who else had been imprisoned in this underground tomb? And how long had this chamber of horrors been operating beneath Riverside Farm? The excavation of the chamber took 3 days. Sarah watched as forensic teams worked in carefully coordinated shifts, documenting every bone, every scrap of fabric, every fragment of evidence that emerged from the dirt floor. The rain continued unabated, forcing them to construct a protective canopy over the collapsed section of the farmhouse to prevent further deterioration of the crime scene. By the end of the first day, Lisa Chen's preliminary assessment had been confirmed. The chamber contained the skeletal remains of at least 12 individuals, possibly more. The bones showed varying degrees of decomposition, suggesting deaths spanning multiple decades. Sarah sat in her temporary command post, a trailer the sheriff's department had brought to the site, studying the growing collection of evidence photographs. The 5 Webb cousins had been identified through dental records and DNA comparison with surviving family members, but the other remains presented a more complex puzzle. The oldest bones date back approximately 70 years, Lisa explained during their evening briefing. Maybe longer. The preservation is poor because of the moisture in the chamber, which makes precise dating difficult. But the youngest remains, apart from the Webb cousins, appear to be from the 1970s or early 1980s. David Park spread a series of photographs across the trailer's small table. "We found personal effects mixed with the remains. A class ring from Riverside High School dated 1973. A locket with a photograph inside, the image degraded but showing what appears to be a young woman. And this." He placed an evidence bag containing a small, tarnished metal object on the table. Sarah picked it up, examining it through the clear plastic. It was a name bracelet, the kind popular with teenagers in the mid-20th century. She could just make out the engraved letters. Dorothy. "I've started cross-referencing missing persons cases from this area going back to 1950, Sarah said, pulling up her laptop. There are 17 unsolved disappearances of young people within a 50-mile radius over that time period. 12 of them were female, ages ranging from 14 to 22. Morrison, who had been standing near the trailer door, moved closer. "You're thinking this goes back further than Evelyn Webb?" "I'm thinking this chamber has been used for a very long time," Sarah replied. "Evelyn was born in 1918, which means she would have been in her 50s during the 1970s. But if the oldest remains are from the 1950s, she would have been in her 30s. And if Lisa's right about some bones potentially being 70 years old or more, we're looking at crimes that might predate Evelyn's ownership of the property." "Who owned the farm before her?" David asked. Sarah had already researched that question. Evelyn's parents, Thomas and Margaret Hayes. They purchased the property in 1923 and lived there until their deaths in the 1960s. The farm passed to Evelyn and her husband Robert, but Robert died in 1971. After that, Evelyn lived alone until her dementia progressed enough to require the nursing home in 1998. Lisa was studying the photographs of the skeletal remains with intense focus. "I noticed something disturbing during the excavation," she said quietly. Several of the victims show signs of prolonged malnutrition and evidence of repetitive stress injuries consistent with restraint. The bone development suggests these individuals were imprisoned for extended periods before death. The implications settled over the group like a physical weight. The chamber hadn't been used for quick disposal of bodies. It had been a place where victims were kept alive, imprisoned in darkness, slowly dying from starvation, dehydration, or lack of oxygen. Sarah thought of the carved message on the wall. "The air is getting bad." She'd been researching the ventilation in the chamber. The single air vent they'd found had been deliberately blocked from the outside with a wooden cover, likely after the victims were locked inside. "We need to excavate the rest of the property," Morrison said. "If this chamber was in use for 70 years, there might be other burial sites, other hidden spaces." Sarah nodded. "I've already requested ground-penetrating radar equipment from the state. It should arrive tomorrow. But Tom, we need to start thinking about the public response. When this goes public, and it will, we're talking about potentially the largest serial murder case in Nebraska history." "Multiple serial killers," David corrected. "Unless Evelyn Webb lived to be over 100 and started killing in her teens, we're looking at least 2 perpetrators, possibly 3 generations." The trailer fell silent. Sarah's mind struggled with the magnitude of what they were uncovering. A family legacy of murder, spanning decades, hidden beneath an ordinary farmhouse in rural Nebraska. How many families had spent years wondering what happened to their missing daughters, their vanished sisters, never knowing they'd been imprisoned and left to die just miles from home. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email. Sarah opened it and felt her blood run cold. It was from the State Archives, a response to her request for historical records on the Hayes family. Attached was a scanned newspaper article from the Riverside Gazette, dated September 1951. The headline read, "Local Girl Missing After County Fair." Below it was a photograph of a smiling young woman wearing a name bracelet. Even in the grainy scan, Sarah could read the name engraved on it. Dorothy. Dorothy Kellerman, age 16, had disappeared on September 14, 1951, after attending the county fair with friends. She'd last been seen accepting a ride home from a kindly older woman, who witnesses described as Margaret Hayes, a respected farmer's wife known for her charitable work with local youth. Sarah looked up at her colleagues, the photograph still displayed on her laptop screen. "I think I just found our first victim, and I think this goes back even further than we imagined." The discovery of Dorothy Kellerman's identity opened a floodgate of historical research. Sarah spent the following day in the basement archives of the Riverside Public Library, surrounded by decades of yellowed newspapers and dusty records, while the forensic team continued their excavation at the farm. The librarian, a woman in her 70s named Helen Pritchard, had proven invaluable. When Sarah explained what she was researching, Helen's face had gone pale. I remember Dorothy's disappearance, Helen said quietly, settling into a chair across from Sarah. I was only 8 years old, but the whole town talked about it for months. My mother wouldn't let me out of her sight for a year afterward. What do you remember about the investigation? Sarah asked. There wasn't much of one, to be honest. The sheriff at the time, a man named Walter Cobb, decided Dorothy had run off with some boyfriend nobody knew about. Her parents insisted that wasn't true, that Dorothy would never leave without telling them, but Helen trailed off, shaking her head. People didn't question authority the way they do now. If the sheriff said she ran away, that was the official story. Sarah pulled up the scanned article on her laptop. This mentions Margaret Hayes gave her a ride. Was she ever questioned? Not officially. Margaret was well respected in the community, active in the church, always helping young people. She ran some kind of mentorship program through the Methodist congregation, taking in troubled girls, teaching them domestic skills. Everyone thought she was a saint. Something in Helen's tone caught Sarah's attention. But you didn't think so? Helen was quiet for a moment, her fingers worrying at the edge of her cardigan. My older sister, Ruth, she was part of Margaret's program for a while in 1953. Ruth was going through a rebellious phase, and my parents thought Margaret's guidance would help. But Ruth only went to the Hayes farm twice before she refused to go back. Did she say why? She would never talk about it. Just said there was something wrong with that place, something wrong with Margaret. My parents didn't push it because Ruth started behaving better anyway, like she'd been frightened straight. Helen's eyes met Sarah's. Ruth died 10 years ago, but before she passed, she told me something. She said Margaret had shown her the storm shelter beneath the farmhouse and told her it was where disobedient girls went. Ruth thought she was joking at first, but then Margaret locked her down there for 2 hours, alone in the dark, as a lesson about obedience. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Did your sister report this? To whom? Margaret Hayes was untouchable, and Ruth was terrified that if she said anything, Margaret would tell my parents lies about her, or worse, put her back in that hole for good. So she kept quiet and counted herself lucky to escape. The implications were staggering. Margaret Hayes had been using the underground chamber as a tool of psychological torture and control as early as 1953. But Dorothy Kellerman had disappeared in 1951, 2 years earlier. If Margaret had imprisoned Dorothy, was it the first time, or had she been refining her methods for years? Sarah spent the rest of the morning searching through missing persons reports from the 1940s and 1950s. A pattern began to emerge. Every 2 to 3 years, a young woman between the ages of 14 and 20 would disappear from the area. Some were labeled runaways, others remained unsolved mysteries. But in at least 4 cases, witnesses reported seeing the missing girl with Margaret Hayes shortly before the disappearance. By noon, Sarah had compiled a list of 9 potential victims from the Hayes era. When she cross-referenced their descriptions with Lisa Chen's analysis of the skeletal remains, 6 matches seemed probable based on age, gender, and estimated time of death. Her phone rang. It was Lisa calling from the excavation site. "Sarah, we found something else," Lisa said, her voice tight. "A second chamber." "Where?" "About 30 feet from the first one, connected by a narrow tunnel. It was sealed with stones, deliberately hidden. We only found it because we were mapping the underground layout. Sarah, this chamber is older, much older. The construction is more primitive." "Are there remains?" "Yes. At least 5 individuals, all female based on preliminary examination. But Sarah, these aren't recent. The bones are in much worse condition than anything in the first chamber. I'd estimate they're at least 100 years old, possibly older. We're looking at deaths from the late 19th or very early 20th century. Sarah closed her eyes, the full horror of Riverside Farm crystallizing in her mind. This wasn't just 3 generations of killers. This was a legacy that stretched back over a century, a family tradition of imprisoning and murdering young women, passed down from mother to daughter like some nightmarish inheritance. "I'm coming back to the site," Sarah said. "Don't let anyone else into that second chamber until I get there." As she gathered her research and prepared to leave the library, Helen Pritchard touched her arm gently. "Detective, there's one more thing you should know about the Hayes family," Helen said. "Margaret's mother, the woman who originally homesteaded that land in the 1890s, her name was Constance Blake. She came to Nebraska from somewhere back east under mysterious circumstances. A woman alone with a small daughter. No husband. People whispered about her, said she was strange, that she had peculiar ideas about discipline and righteousness. Young women who worked for her sometimes disappeared, but it was frontier times. People came and went. Nobody thought to investigate too closely. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How far back does this go? Helen's expression was haunted. "I don't know, Detective, but I think you're going to find out." The second chamber was smaller than the first. Its walls rough-hewn from bedrock with tools that predated modern equipment. Sarah descended through the narrow connecting tunnel, her flashlight revealing crude chisel marks in the stone, evidence of backbreaking labor performed over months or years. Lisa Chen waited for her at the entrance to the chamber, her face drawn with exhaustion and something else, a haunted quality that Sarah had seen in investigators who'd witnessed too much human darkness. "Prepare yourself," Lisa said quietly. "This one is different." Sarah stepped into the space and immediately understood what Lisa meant. Unlike the first chamber, which bore signs of utilitarian imprisonment, this room had been deliberately designed for suffering. Iron rings had been hammered into the walls at intervals, still bearing fragments of rusted chains. The floor was stained with substances Sarah didn't want to identify, and carved into every available surface were messages, hundreds of them, scratched by desperate fingers into unyielding stone. "Help me. Please, God, let me die. Mama, I'm sorry. My name is Catherine. I was 17. The messages overlapped and intersected, a palimpsest of agony spanning decades. Sarah moved slowly through the chamber, documenting each inscription with her camera, feeling the weight of each plea, each final testament of young women who died in darkness. "We've identified the remains as 5 individuals, all female, ages approximately 14 to 22 at time of death," Lisa reported, her voice professionally clinical but her hands trembling slightly. "The bone analysis suggests deaths occurred between 1895 and 1920, give or take a few years. Cause of death appears to be starvation in most cases, though one shows signs of blunt force trauma to the skull." Sarah's light found a section of wall where the messages were more organized, less frantic. Someone had taken the time to carve names and dates with careful precision. Catherine Morrison, 1897. Abigail Fletcher, 1899. Sarah Donovan, 1903. Eleanor Price, 1908. Mary Sullivan, 1912. 5 names, 5 sets of remains. Each one a daughter, a sister, a missing piece of some family's heart. "Constance Blake," Sarah murmured. This was her work. David Park had descended into the chamber behind them. He moved to examine the carved names, his expression grim. "I've been researching the Blake family history. Constance came to Nebraska in 1893 from Pennsylvania. Before that, there are records of her living in a small town outside Pittsburgh, where 3 young women disappeared between 1889 and 1892. No connection was ever made to Constance, but she left town rather suddenly after the 3rd disappearance." "And before Pennsylvania?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I'm still tracing back, but there are hints she might have been in New York State before that, and possibly Massachusetts before that. Each place she lived, young women disappeared. She was good at choosing victims, girls who were alone or troubled, or from families without resources to push for investigations." Sarah thought of the pattern that had repeated itself for over a century. Constance Blake, to Margaret Hayes, to Evelyn Webb, each generation inheriting not just the farm, but a twisted legacy of violence. But why? What possible motivation could drive 3 generations of women to imprisonment and murder? Her light found something else carved into the wall, partially obscured by later messages. Sarah knelt to examine it more closely, brushing away accumulated dirt with her gloved fingers. The words emerged slowly, written in an educated hand quite different from the desperate pleas surrounding it. The daughters of Eve must atone for the original sin. Only through suffering can they be purified. Only through darkness can they see the light. I am the instrument of God's correction. CB 1893. Sarah read the inscription aloud, and Lisa drew in a sharp breath. Religious psychosis, Lisa said. She believed she was punishing women for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. She saw herself as an instrument of divine justice. And she passed that belief to her daughter, David added. Who passed it to her daughter? A matrilineal cult of one, each generation indoctrinating the next. Sarah stood, her mind working through the implications. Religious delusion didn't excuse the crimes, but it provided a framework for understanding them. Constance Blake had created a twisted theology that justified her actions, and her descendants had absorbed and perpetuated it. But that raised another question. If this was a tradition passed from mother to daughter, where was the next generation? Evelyn Webb had died in 2000. Did the legacy die with her, or was there someone else? Someone who knew about the chambers and had kept the secret for 29 years? Sarah remembered Morrison's initial report, the modern water bottle found near the entrance to the first chamber. Someone had been accessing these spaces recently, long after Evelyn's death. We need to find out if Evelyn Webb had any daughters, Sarah said urgently, or granddaughters, anyone who might have been taught the family tradition. David was already pulling up records on his tablet. His face paled as he read. Sarah, Evelyn had one daughter, Catherine Webb, mother of Marcus and Lily, but Catherine died in 2018. She had only 2 children, both of whom disappeared in 1996. What about extended family? Cousins, nieces? Searching now. David's fingers moved rapidly across the screen. Then he stopped, his expression shifting from concentration to alarm. There's one more. Margaret Hayes had 2 daughters, Evelyn and a younger sister named Ruth. Ruth Hayes married a man named Thomas Blackwood in 1957. They had one daughter, Diane, born in 1959. Where is Diane Blackwood now? Sarah asked, though something in David's expression told her she wasn't going to like the answer. According to records, she's living in Riverside. Has been for the past 15 years. She works as a hospice nurse at the county medical center. David looked up from his tablet, his eyes meeting Sarah's. Sarah, Diane Blackwood was the attending nurse when Evelyn Webb died in the nursing home in 2000. And before that, she was Margaret Hayes' primary caregiver during her final illness in 1989. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Diane Blackwood, the daughter of Evelyn's sister, would have been raised with knowledge of the family legacy. She would have been taught the twisted theology that justified the murders. And she would have been present at the deaths of both her grandmother and her aunt, likely the keepers of the family's darkest secrets. Sarah's radio crackled to life. It was Morrison, calling from the command post above ground. Sarah, we have a situation. A woman just showed up at the perimeter asking to speak with whoever's in charge of the investigation. Says she has information about the Webb case. Says her name is Diane Blackwood. Sarah exchanged glances with Lisa and David. Don't let her leave, Tom. We're coming up now. As they made their way back through the tunnel to the first chamber, Sarah's mind raced. Why would Diane Blackwood come forward now, after 29 years of silence? Was it guilt or something else? And more importantly, what role had she played in the imprisonment and death of her 5 cousins? Sarah emerged from the underground chambers into the gray afternoon light. rain still falling in steady sheets. The excavation site had taken on the appearance of a military operation, with forensic tents, equipment trailers, and crime scene tape transforming the once quiet farm into a hub of controlled chaos. Morrison stood near the command trailer with a woman Sarah estimated to be in her mid-60s. She was slight of build, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and wearing a practical rain jacket over what appeared to be nurse's scrubs. Her face bore the same prominent cheekbones and dark eyes that Sarah had seen in the photographs of the Webb cousins, the unmistakable family features that marked her as one of them. "Detective Brennan," Morrison said as Sarah approached. "This is Diane Blackwood. She says she needs to speak with you about what happened in 1996. Diane's eyes met Sarah's with an intensity that was unsettling. There was no fear in them, no nervousness at being confronted by law enforcement. Instead, Sarah saw something that looked almost like relief. "Thank you for seeing me, Detective," Diane said, her voice soft but steady. "I've been watching the news coverage of the excavation. I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. I'm here to provide my statement voluntarily." Sarah gestured toward the command trailer. "Let's talk inside, out of the rain." Once seated in the trailer's small interview space, Sarah activated the recording equipment and read Diane her rights. The woman listened patiently, then signed the waiver form without hesitation. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sarah began, "you stated you have information about the disappearance of Marcus Webb, Lily Webb, Jennifer Hartwell, Claire Hartwell, and Daniel Hartwell in August 1996. What can you tell me about that night?" Diane folded her hands on the table, her expression calm but sorrowful. "I can tell you everything, Detective, because I was there. I was the one who helped Aunt Evelyn lock them in the chamber." The admission hung in the air. Sarah forced herself to remain professional, though her pulse quickened. "Please explain what happened, from the beginning." Diane drew a slow breath. "To understand what happened that night, you need to understand the family I grew up in. My mother, Ruth Hayes Blackwood, was the younger sister of Evelyn Webb. Ruth left home at 17, married my father, and tried to distance herself from the Hayes family. But my grandmother, Margaret Hayes, wouldn't allow it. She insisted I spend summers at the farm, learning what she called the old ways." "The old ways," Sarah repeated. "What did that mean?" "It meant learning the family's purpose, the sacred duty that had been passed down from Constance Blake to Margaret to Evelyn. The duty to purify the daughters of Eve through suffering and darkness." Diane's voice remained eerily steady, as if she were reciting a catechism learned long ago. "Margaret taught me the theology when I was 12 years old. She took me down into the chambers and showed me what was left of the girls who had been purified there. She told me it was my birthright and my burden." Sarah felt her stomach turn. "Your mother allowed this?" "My mother tried to keep me away after she found out, but by then it was too late. I truly believed that what Margaret and Aunt Evelyn were doing was holy work." Diane's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion. "I was young and impressionable, and they convinced me that we were saving these girls' souls by punishing their flesh. Did you participate in the abduction and imprisonment of victims during your youth?" "No. Margaret stopped taking girls after 1978. She was too old by then, and the world had changed. Police were more thorough, families more vigilant. She and Evelyn agreed the work would have to pause until the time was right again." Diane looked down at her folded hands. But then, in 1996, something happened. Evelyn's dementia was getting worse, and in her confused state, she became convinced the family was being punished for abandoning the sacred duty. She believed that only by offering her own bloodline could she atone for the years of inaction. Sarah felt a chill despite the trailer's warmth. "She decided to sacrifice her own grandchildren?" "She called me the night they arrived," Diane continued. She was agitated, speaking in confused fragments about Eve's daughters and blood atonement. "I drove to the farm to check on her. When I arrived, the 5 cousins were asleep in the living room, watching television. Evelyn had drugged their sodas with sleeping pills crushed into the drinks. And you helped her move them into the chamber? Diane nodded slowly. I did. One by one, we carried them down through the access point in the old root cellar. They started to wake up as the drugs wore off, became frightened, started crying. I remember Lily begging her grandmother to let them out, promising they'd be good. But Evelyn just kept saying they had to be purified, that it was God's will. Sarah's hands clenched beneath the table. Why didn't you stop her? Call the police? Get help? Because I still believed, Diane said, tears finally breaking through her composure. I still believed in the theology I'd been taught. I thought we were saving their souls. It wasn't until the third day when I went back to the farm to bring them food and water that I started to doubt. What changed? I heard them singing, Diane whispered. Hymns. They were singing hymns in the darkness, praying together. I stood at the access point listening, and I realized they already had the faith we claimed to be instilling through suffering. They didn't need purification. They were innocent. She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. But by then, Evelyn had sealed the access point with stones and concrete. She decided that full atonement required complete sacrifice. She wouldn't let me open it. Sarah leaned forward. You're telling me you tried to save them? I tried. I begged Evelyn to release them. I even attempted to break through the seal myself, but the concrete had set and I didn't have the right tools. When I threatened to call the police, Evelyn... Diane paused, her breath shaking. She told me if I did, she would tell them I had planned the whole thing, that it was my idea. She had written letters to make it look like I was the mastermind. I was terrified. I was only 37, with 2 young children of my own. So I did nothing. You let them die. Yes. The word was barely audible. I let them die. For 3 weeks I could hear them getting weaker each time I visited. The singing stopped. The crying stopped. Eventually everything stopped. And I have lived with that silence for 29 years. Sarah sat back, processing the confession. Part of her wanted to rage at the woman across the table, to condemn her for the cowardice that had condemned 5 innocent young people to a horrific death. But she also recognized something in Diane's haunted eyes. A prisoner of different kind, trapped not by stone walls but by indoctrination, fear, and guilt. Why come forward now? Sarah asked. Because I saw on the news that you'd found the chambers. I knew you'd find the remains, and eventually you'd find me. But also, Diane met Sarah's gaze directly. I'm dying, Detective. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4. I don't believe in the theology anymore. I haven't for years. But I do believe in judgment, and I need to face it with the truth finally spoken. Sarah reached for her radio. Tom, I need you in here. And call the DA's office. We're going to need charges drawn up. As Morrison entered the trailer and began the formal arrest process, Diane remained calm, almost peaceful. She had carried the weight of 5 deaths for nearly 3 decades, and the burden was finally being lifted, even if it meant spending her final months in a jail cell. But Sarah still had questions. Mrs. Blackwood, one more thing. We found evidence that someone has been accessing the chambers recently, within the past few years. Was that you? Diane looked confused. No, I haven't been to the farm since 1998, when Evelyn went into the nursing home. I couldn't bear to go back. Then who? Sarah pressed. Who else knows about the chambers? Diane's expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror. Oh God, no, she couldn't have. She was too young. She wouldn't have understood. Who? My daughter, Diane whispered. Rachel Blackwood. When she was 16, she found my journals, the ones where I'd written about the family legacy. I thought I'd convinced her it was all madness, that she should forget what she'd read. But what if? She looked up at Sarah, her eyes wide with fear. Detective, what if I passed it on to her without meaning to? What if she believes? Sarah's immediate call to dispatch revealed that Rachel Blackwood, age 34, worked as a guidance counselor at Riverside High School. According to personnel records, she lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town and had no criminal record. She was described by colleagues as quiet, dedicated to her students, and intensely private. "Morrison, I need units at Rachel Blackwood's residence immediately," Sarah said, already moving toward her vehicle. "And get me a warrant. If she's been accessing those chambers, there might be evidence at her home." The drive to Rachel's address took 15 minutes through the rain-soaked streets. Sarah's mind worked furiously through the implications. If Rachel had discovered her mother's journals at 16, that would have been in 2007, 11 years after the Webb cousins died. What had she done with that knowledge? Had she simply been visiting the chambers out of morbid curiosity, or was there something darker at work? The house was a modest ranch-style home set back from the road, surrounded by overgrown hedges that provided privacy from neighbors. 2 patrol cars were already positioned at the curb when Sarah arrived, their lights painting the gray afternoon in strobing blue and red. Deputy Reynolds met her at the edge of the property. "No movement inside, Detective. Windows are covered with heavy curtains. We haven't approached yet, waiting for your signal." Sarah studied the house, noting the excessive privacy measures. Every window had blackout curtains. The yard was unkempt, as if Rachel wanted to discourage visitors. A single vehicle sat in the driveway, a nondescript sedan covered in a layer of grime. "Let's make contact," Sarah decided. "But stay alert. We don't know what we're walking into." They approached the front door, Sarah in the lead with Reynolds and 2 other deputies flanking her. She knocked firmly, identifying herself as law enforcement. "Rachel Blackwood, this is Detective Sarah Brennan with the Sheriff's Department. I need to speak with you." No response. Sarah knocked again, louder this time. "Ms. Blackwood, we have a warrant to search the premises. Please open the door." Still nothing. Sarah nodded to Reynolds, who produced a battering ram. One solid strike and the door gave way, swinging inward to reveal a darkened interior. The smell hit them immediately. Not decay, but something else. A mixture of incense, candle wax, and something chemical Sarah couldn't immediately identify. She drew her weapon and entered, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The living room was sparsely furnished but meticulously organized. What immediately caught Sarah's attention was the wall opposite the entrance. It was covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all pinned to a large corkboard in an elaborate pattern. Sarah approached slowly, her flashlight revealing the scope of what Rachel had created. It was a shrine to the family's legacy. Photographs of Constance Blake, Margaret Hayes, and Evelyn Webb occupied the center, surrounded by images of their victims. Each photograph was labeled with a name, date, and the word "purified," written in careful script. But it was the bottom section of the board that made Sarah's blood run cold. New photographs, taken within the last few years, showed young women Sarah didn't recognize. 5 of them, all appearing to be teenagers or young adults. Each photo was marked with recent dates and a location. "The sanctuary." "Detective, you need to see this," Reynolds called from deeper in the house. Sarah followed his voice to what should have been a bedroom, but had been converted into something else entirely. The walls were lined with shelves containing journals, dozens of them, dating back years. A desk held an open laptop, its screen still glowing. Reynolds had already photographed the screen. It showed a document titled "The New Testament of Purification." Sarah leaned closer to read. "My mother was weak. She abandoned the sacred duty out of fear and doubt. But I have been chosen to restore the family's purpose. The old chambers are compromised, discovered by the unworthy. But I have created a new sanctuary, a place where the daughters of Eve can be properly cleansed. 5 are currently undergoing purification. Their suffering will restore our family's standing in God's eyes." Sarah's heart hammered. Those photos on the wall, the 5 women marked the sanctuary. They're current victims. She has them somewhere, alive, right now. She turned to Reynolds. Get every available unit here. We need to search this house top to bottom, find any indication of where she's keeping them. Check utility bills, property records, storage unit rentals, everything. As the deputies began their systematic search, Sarah focused on the laptop, scrolling through Rachel's detailed records. The woman had documented everything. The selection of her victims, young women she'd identified as troubled, through her work as a school counselor. The construction of her new sanctuary, apparently a renovated storm shelter on a property she'd inherited from her father, and her theological justifications for continuing the family tradition. "Detective," another deputy called from the basement stairs. "There's a map down here." Sarah descended into the basement, which Rachel had converted into a workshop. Tools hung on pegboards, and a large table held architectural drawings. The map was pinned to the wall, a detailed survey of a rural property 20 miles outside Riverside, with an X marking a location labeled Sanctuary Entrance. Sarah photographed the map and immediately called Morrison. "Tom, I've got a location. I need tactical units and ambulances standing by. We have 5 potential victims being held at an underground shelter. Rachel Blackwood is our active suspect, and she's not here." "Where is she?" Morrison asked. Sarah's eyes fell on a calendar hanging near the workspace. Today's date was circled in red, with a notation, "Final Purification, Sunset." She checked her watch. Sunset was in 90 minutes. "She's at the shelter," Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. "And she's planning to kill them tonight. We need to move now." The tactical response was swift and coordinated. Within 30 minutes, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles was racing toward the rural property marked on Rachel's map. Sarah rode with the lead tactical unit, studying the architectural drawings they'd found. The shelter was sophisticated, far more elaborate than the crude chambers at Riverside Farm. Rachel had spent years and significant money creating her sanctuary. As they approached the property, the team switched to stealth mode, killing sirens and lights as they navigated the muddy access road. The land was heavily wooded, isolated, perfect for someone who wanted to operate without witnesses. The shelter entrance was exactly where the map indicated, concealed beneath a storm cellar door in a small clearing. Sarah's team surrounded the entrance while tactical officers prepared to breach. "Police! Rachel Blackwood, if you're down there, come out with your hands visible," Sarah called into the darkness. The response came not from Rachel but from below. A woman's scream, high and terrified. Then another voice, and another. A chorus of desperate cries for help. "They're alive," Sarah breathed. "Breach it now!" The tactical team descended rapidly, their weapons and lights cutting through the underground darkness. Sarah followed close behind, her weapon drawn, prepared for armed resistance. But Rachel Blackwood offered no resistance. They found her in the main chamber of the shelter, kneeling before an altar she'd constructed, her hands folded in prayer. Around her, chained to the walls by modern restraints, were 5 young women in various states of distress. The youngest appeared to be 14, the oldest perhaps 22, all malnourished, dehydrated, clearly terrified. Rachel looked up as the tactical team surrounded her, and Sarah saw in her eyes the same religious fervor that must have burned in Constance Blake over a century ago. "You're interrupting the sacred work," Rachel said calmly. "They haven't been fully purified yet. Their suffering is incomplete." "It's over, Rachel," Sarah said, lowering her weapon as tactical officers moved in to secure the suspect. "The work, as you call it, is finished. You're under arrest." As paramedics rushed in to attend to the victims, Sarah watched Rachel being led away in handcuffs. Unlike her mother, who had shown remorse in the end, Rachel's expression remained serene, convinced even in capture that she had been doing God's will. But the screams of the rescued victims, their tears of relief and trauma, told a different story. They told the truth that Sarah had dedicated her career to uncovering. That evil wasn't divine, it was profoundly, devastatingly human. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Nebraska State Archives, holding a leather-bound journal that had been recovered from Rachel Blackwood's home. It was the oldest of the collection, written in Constance Blake's careful script, dated 1887. The journal had provided the final piece of the puzzle, revealing that Constance's pathology had begun even earlier than they'd suspected. Before Nebraska, before Pennsylvania, she had been in Massachusetts, where at least 6 young women had disappeared from the textile mill where Constance had worked as a supervisor. The murders had begun there, fueled by Constance's twisted interpretation of Scripture and her obsessive belief that women needed to be punished for Eve's original sin. The legacy had indeed spanned over a century and 3 states. The current count of confirmed victims stood at 42, though Sarah suspected the true number might never be known. Rachel Blackwood had been found competent to stand trial and was currently serving 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. She remained unrepentant, convinced that her imprisonment was simply another test of faith. Diane Blackwood had died in custody 3 months after her arrest, her confession having provided crucial evidence in her daughter's prosecution. But Sarah's focus now was on the survivors. The 5 women rescued from Rachel's sanctuary were recovering, slowly rebuilding their lives with extensive therapy and support. The oldest, a 22-year-old named Amanda Pierce, had been imprisoned for 14 months. She still struggled with nightmares and agoraphobia, but she was alive. They were all alive, and that was what mattered. The families of the 42 identified victims had finally received closure. DNA analysis and forensic genealogy had put names to most of the remains, allowing for proper burials. Sarah had attended many of the memorial services, bearing witness to grief that had waited decades for acknowledgement. The Riverside farm property had been purchased by the state and would be converted into a memorial park, a place of remembrance for the victims. The underground chambers would be sealed permanently. Their dark purpose ended forever. Sarah closed Constance Blake's journal and returned it to the archive's preservation specialist. Some stories needed to be remembered, not to glorify the evil they contained, but to honor those who had suffered and to ensure such horrors never repeated. As she left the archives and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Amanda Pierce. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for finding us." Sarah typed a simple response. "You survived. That's what matters now." She thought of the 5 Webb cousins, of Dorothy Kellerman, of Catherine Morrison and all the others who hadn't survived, whose final days had been spent in darkness and despair. Their stories were finally known, their deaths finally acknowledged. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was truth. And sometimes truth was all that could be offered. The summer rain had finally ended. Nebraska's fields were green and growing, life renewing itself as it always did. Sarah drove back to Riverside, past the farm that had held so many secrets for so long, now just empty land waiting to be transformed into something better. The evil of Constance Blake, Margaret Hayes, Evelyn Webb, and Rachel Blackwood was ended. The legacy was broken, and in the breaking, 42 names had been restored to memory, 42 lives acknowledged, 42 souls finally at rest. Sarah Brennan carried their stories with her, as she would for the rest of her career, because that was the job, not just solving crimes, but bearing witness to those who could no longer speak for themselves, giving voice to the silenced, bringing light to darkness. And in that quiet afternoon, driving through fields of green beneath clear skies, she allowed herself to believe that somewhere, in whatever came after, 5 cousins who had vanished from a farmhouse on an August night in 1996 finally knew peace.